Israel, Palestine. You know that this podcast today will be tragic. So I'm going to ask you to start out and take a breath, close your eyes, and breathe for at least 10 seconds. I'm going to do it. Because we're dealing with tragedy. There's no way of getting around it. I'm going to talk about it, but I don't have a solution that's going to happen in my lifetime. In my lifetime, this stuff will still be going on. You probably know by now I'm Jewish, and I'm proud of being Jewish. And chutzpah is a Hebrew and Yiddish word that means audacity. And so, okay, you know about it. In all my adult life, I've had a strong affinity with Israel, but I consider there are three Israels. And I'm going to tell you about the three. The first one is called Am Yisrael, which means the people of Israel, which means worldwide Jews are people of Israel. The third one, which I don't identify with, is called Medinat Yisrael, which means the government, the system. I can't identify with that now, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Take a breath again. I'll get back to the second one in a moment. But let's start with the Medinat Israel, the state. And I believe that the state, of course, has a right to exist because we need a homeland for Jews who have been kicked out of every country and faced every kind of persecution known to man. So we need one country in the world where there's a Jewish majority. And so the dominant culture would have a Jewish, at least, flavor to it. And the Hebrew language, which is very, very, very important, not only in Israel, but to Jews everywhere in terms of religion and so forth. There's one place in the world, one place, where that's the national language. But it's not enough to be one state in the midst of other people who also want that land. So my slogan is two peoples. That means Jews and Palestinians. Two nations, Israel, Palestine. Two cultures, two languages, and one land, which has to be shared. And it won't happen the way we want in my lifetime. But let me talk about the idea, the ideal. The ideal is equality, is jointness, joint action, real sharing, and the two languages. And there are at least three groups that are active right now, despite the tragedy. Three groups that represent that. And I'm giving money and support to all three groups. One is called the Parents Circle. And that's an amazing organization built on the concept of courage and forgiveness and reconciliation and reaching across all kinds of barriers. And it's a movement of Israelis and Palestinians who have lost a loved one let's say, a child or spouse to the other side. So, for example, the Palestinian guy who started it lost a son who was about 15, who was killed by the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, because of some problem at a checkpoint on the West Bank. And the Israeli young girl, aged 10, was killed because of the Intifada, where people were blowing up terrorism by Palestinians in Israel. And she was killed when a bus blew up. And yet, these two parents have been able to be comrades, friends, colleagues. And they were the core that began this movement that has expanded big time, but not big enough, called the Parents Circle. Now, a second one is called Standing Together. And you might be able to guess what that's about. It's actually in Israel specifically, but it's Palestinian Israelis. That means Israelis who identify as Palestinians but live as Israeli citizens. And of course, Israeli Jews. And they're a political organization. And they're working together. They're working to stop this war. They're working to bring food in to Gaza. They're working through protesting. They want to have elected officials. So they are actively political. The third group, which I don't know much about, is called Veterans of Conflict. So it's actually Israeli veterans of Israeli wars who have now become peace activists. Okay, so if we take all three of those together, plus the families of the hostages who are very, very angry at the government for not really doing what it's supposed to do in rescuing hostages. Instead, it's been focused under Netanyahu to win these wars. Well, I say wars because there's a second one going on in the north against Hezbollah. But the one in Gaza, which has been focused on more, is against Hamas. And right after the incredible event, the incredible, more than a tragedy, a absolute horrifying, disastrous, sort of definitely homicidal, genocidal action by 3,000 Hamas terrorists who managed to get through the southern border because it was not being effectively defended. And what happened on October 7th, 2023 is the most largest information and security screw up by Israel ever. Anyway, right after that happened, my brother and I knew there was going to be a war of revenge, and then Netanyahu was going to turn what had been, soon after, worldwide sympathy into worldwide condemnation and antipathy. But the Secretary of Defense in our country, Lloyd Austin, who was, I believe, a general in the Iraq War, or he was certainly experienced from the Iraq War, which was a total disaster, an outrageous war, totally undocumented, ill. I'm thinking about it because it was so bad. It had no excuse. It was inexcusable, indefensible war that killed millions. And Lloyd Austin said right after October 7th, 2023, that he warned the Israeli government not to do a war of revenge, a war of vengeance because he knew that's what had happened to the Iraq war, except that we were taking out the vengeance on the wrong people who were supposed to be the masters of 9/11. Anyway, this war of vengeance has gone on and on. It became disproportionate to the outrageous genocidal actions by Hamas. It became disproportionate because Israel invaded, didn't stop killing, didn't stop destroying the infrastructure, would not agree to any negotiations like ceasefire, made sure that ceasefire could not happen. And so the wars continued, and the United States has been enabling it. Our government has been enabling it. But those of us who are Jewish and really concerned about the future of Israel do not want the war to be enabled or continued. So what we want instead, at least what I do, is let's say one land, two peoples, two cultures, two nations. All right, even if that can't happen, two states side by side in peace and security would be a great start. And there have been more people talk about that than about the one land, but there's been talk about that since 1967, when I was 16 years old. 16 years old. There's been talk about a two-state solution for all those years. And the talk has not materialized because there's been aggression and warlike actions and domination and exploitation and oppression from Israel on the territories and terrorism from the Palestinians and their supporters against Israel. So you can't build a movement for one land or a movement for two states when there's this much hatred, anger, misunderstanding, long-term sense of injustice. And the injustice gets bigger and bigger, and the solutions fade and fade. And now we're in a war in the north with Hezbollah. And these things are not distinguishable because Hezbollah and Hamas are all of them funded and supported by Iran, which is probably the biggest danger, let's say, in the area. But getting back to Israel and its identity as a nation, its identity started out as a real chutzpah type of action against the world, really. There was a lot of socialist kibbutzim, which are cooperative villages. That, of course, changed, and it became, way too militaristic, and it became basically similar to hyper-capitalistic societies, but, a little different. There's, national health insurance, and there's strong labor movements and so forth. But the mentality has become extremely oriented around military. Whether it's justified or not, once you rely on the military to that degree, it's very hard to get out of it. It's very hard to agree to a ceasefire. And it's very hard for the United States to put actually successful pressure on Israel instead of enabling. And one of the thoughts that I have is that even though Biden was able to wake up, and Secretary of State, what's his name? Anyway, our Secretary of State, I'll come back to that, that they were negotiating a lot. They thought they would make a difference with Netanyahu, but I think there's something above that, above American, a public opinion, and above the efforts of Biden and Secretary I still can't remember his name. Anyway, above those guys, there is something that has more power. And that's the military industrial complex that Dwight Eisenhower talked about many, many years ago. This is what I think. I think that even if we try to reduce the level of support, the billions that go to Israel, in order to reduce the possibility of continued war, in order to make it possible that a ceasefire would happen, and then that would continue, and there might be some negotiations. There's something above it all. And I think it's defense contractors right here in the United States, because they basically have these deals, these contracts. They're in the pipeline. They're in the pipeline, and they worth billions, and that creates jobs and all kinds of economic success or prosperity, or it's linked to the American economy. So to go up against that is way beyond just winning over Congress or public opinion. It's a force above that. It's a force that's behind the scenes. And it's a force that has to be challenged. But back to Israel, we, meaning those who care about Israel, and of course, Israelis, and of course, Palestinians, there has to be a really powerful movement that believes in what I'm talking about, which is the most radical thing possible. One land, two nations, two languages, two religions, and again, one land. Okay, I fucked it up. Yeah, Secretary of State.